I'm going to start now. Nothing has happened before this point. So I just want to give you a few little questions to carry through the next hour or so. And one of them is the question of science and conscience. And in
conscience.
In German, we have the same situation. We have Wissenschaft und Gewissen. So conscience also has, it's like this science and conscience, they're connected. But are they? You know, do we have a science without conscience? What would be if conscience really became science? Just that's a riddle I want to put in your minds. The other one which we have to carry is, but I'm sure many of you are living with it anyway, the whole question of technology anyway and where it's going. It's very clear. We're all told that we're at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, which, you know, maybe people see it differently, but as far as I understand it, that involves, if we would all really go along with it, us becoming machines to some degree, linking ourselves with technology so that we would begin to develop attributes of machines. So that's technology going off, and how are we with that? I would say that Francis Bacon is at the beginning of that progress, as you'll see later. And so if we're coming to the root of the problem, as it were, that's one of the problems we need to get to the root of big time. The other question is, which we have very strongly now, is we have this new phrase, we've had it for at least 2 years, if not more, which is follow the science. And I just ask you what you think. Is that what you do with science? Do you follow it? My sense is you don't. You follow, I don't know what you follow. You follow orders, or you follow, maybe in the Middle Ages, you followed the church or something, but do you follow science, or do you practice science? Or it's a strange expression. And yeah, that's also, I suppose, the whole question of freedom and science is what that's about. Perhaps some of you saw a very disturbing interview that Anthony Fauci gave in Washington Cathedral, where he's sitting on the steps as if in front of the altar. And he says a lot of people have had been used to having a lot of freedom and making their own decisions. But now they're going to have to get used to doing what they're told. So in 2021, telling, you know, adult human beings over the world that they're meant to accept what's going on and follow the science. So this is, you know, there's a big question there, what's happening with science if it starts doing that. And I'd like to, well, I'll paraphrase something that Rudolf Steiner said in a lecture where he talks about this phenomenon of science, and he particularly focuses on medicine becoming something that people are made to obey rigidly in the same way they were made to obey the orders of the church in the Middle Ages. And he calls that, in this lecture, the principle of Jesuitism. And he says we don't have to speak about the church because this principle can operate in many other areas, like in medicine, which I would say is what's happening at the moment. But the reason I'm referring to this is because what Steiner says about that, he says it will happen, and this will happen more and more. This was in I'm not quite sure when, 1919, something like this, when he said it. And he said this will happen, and it will go on happening until we wake up to something. He said these are trials that humanity will have to face until actually it's able to live up to the demands of the consciousness soul age. I could find the quote, but I promise you that is more or less what it says. This will grow stronger and stronger. People will find themselves more and more tied down by what authority imposes upon them. And in face of this Ahrimanic opposition, for such it is, salvation for the fifth post-Atlantean epoch will be found in asserting the rights of the consciousness soul, which is wishing to develop. For those of you who speak German, he says, das Heil wird darin bestehen, geltend zu machen, das Recht der Bewusstseinsseele. I would say, bring it about, allow it to be what it is, develop it to what it is. And if we do that, he says, we'll overcome this trial, which is optimistic, but there's the challenge of what we have to do. So those themes I will return to without mentioning them, but science and conscience and technology, and whether we just follow science, and this what does it mean to geltend zu machen, to allow the consciousness soul to be what it is. And coming back to this theme, as you all know, to talk about Shakespeare and Bacon, we're going back quite a long way. We're going back over 400 years now. I'm mainly looking this evening around the time 1604. And, I'm sure some people could say, gosh, well, in what we're living through now, what is that to go back to the beginning of the 17th century? But it's a very important time. The English-speaking world has played and continues to play a hugely dominant role. And I would say has done, particularly since then, since before, obviously, the time of Elizabeth, but that conjunction of Shakespeare and Bacon and James I in Britain, the beginning of the 17th century, are, I would say, like what to call them, like a really significant trio for the consciousness soul age that was developing and is going on doing so. So it's like there's a key in there for what's going on. So we go back to the root of the problem of this consciousness soul age, which we're meant to validate. And there's a couple of things which you may or may not know if we talk about the consciousness soul age, which Rudolf Steiner gives this interesting date of 1413 as the beginning of it. It's a date that many people think, gosh, did it really start in 1413? Do we know anything about this particular date? Well, there's one thing we know, which I was, I doubt very many people here do know, but it's very, very interesting, that Christian Rosenkreutz, in the life described in the manifestos that came out at the beginning of the 17th century, is described as having been born in 1378. And Rudolf Steiner describes in a lecture Christian Rosenkreutz, aged 28, going out to the East, and for 7 years, in a way imbibing the wisdom and the initiation wisdom of the East for 7 years, and then coming back to Europe when he was 35. And Steiner says, and when he comes back, that's really when you can place the beginning of the Rosicrucian movement. Well, if you add 1378 and 35, you come to the year 1413. I'm grateful to Terry Boardman for pointing this out. So Christian Rosenkreutz, age 35, which many of you probably know is the time in the human biography that Steiner describes as the coming into the consciousness soul for an individual. So at 35, Christian Rosenkreutz comes into Europe. It's the beginning of what Steiner says is then the Rosicrucian stream in the way we know it, or have known it. And that's in 1413. It's a fairly extraordinary phenomenon. And quite positive, actually, that the very beginning of this age, we have that unknown event, but I'm sure hugely significant in the background. The other thing that we know a little bit more about, and through Rudolf Steiner we can know more about, again, it's still quite a riddle, is that if you look at the lectures that Andre has been looking at with some other people, these lectures called History as Symptomatology, or in English, they're one of the titles From Symptom to Reality in Modern History, lectures by Rudolf Steiner in 1918. And in a way, he's trying to help people. He said, okay, how do we look at history? It's not just, let's do it in the normal way. What have we got to do if we're really to be able to get somewhere with history? And he starts with the consciousness soul age. He says, okay, how do we address this? And immediately he places us before this huge riddle. Lecture 2 and I think also lecture 3 are largely devoted to this individual of James I. It says consciousness soul age. How do we try to understand it? Let's look at this individual of James I. And for those of you who have read those lectures and other lectures of Steiner's about James I, it's pretty difficult to understand not what he's talking about, but to get to grips with this individual that he's talking about. He says there that, maybe it's there or somewhere else, he says that everything that James I said and wrote doesn't give us any idea of what was really working in him, which is quite challenging. If we were to meet and one of you said, look, let's meet, but nothing I say or I've written anywhere will give you any idea of what's actually living in me. Maybe it's the case with all of us, but that's placed as this riddle about this person. And then Steiner says that the most terrible things have been said about this individual James I, which is true. You can read all sorts of books to this day that, describe him as an absolute disaster on the throne and corrupt and this, that, and the other, and making the most terrible decisions and all the rest of it. And Steiner also says you can read descriptions in the most positive of ways. And then Steiner says, and both of these descriptions would be correct. Which leaves you in front of another great question mark on what we're meant to do with that one. And this was in a way, again, I have to thank Terry Boardman, who first raised these questions to me, and that set me going for some years to live into it. I'd shown no interest at all in this individual, James I. Steiner also refers to him as an initiate at certain points, or certainly an occultist, and so there's a big riddle to be had of this individual whom, history still doesn't do, presents in pretty strange ways. So I read a bit more, particularly of what Rudolf Steiner wrote or didn't write, said. And in a way, Steiner just deepens the riddle in a huge way, particularly with these two directions, the positive direction and the negative direction. So the negative direction, this is a small quote from Rudolf Steiner. He just says, James I, who stands at the beginning of the renewal of the brotherhoods. That's from the lectures, The Karma of Untruthfulness. At the beginning of the renewal of the brotherhoods, and that's in the context of talking about the role of the Western occult brotherhoods in history, which there's no way on earth he's describing a positive role. He also, at the time of James I, a very Ahrimanic new development was inaugurated. It's also Rudolf Steiner. So there's something really dark, let's call it. There's also a direct occult, we could say Ahrimanic influence into politics comes about through James I. And he's the beginning of the brotherhood. So there's a book by Sergei Prokofiev about Russia. Perhaps some of you know, it's called the Eastern Europe and the Future Mysteries of the Holy Grail. And he writes quite a lot about James I in there, but he only focuses on this aspect, the sort of negative aspect. But there's another aspect too. So this is, that was from volume 1 of Karmic Relationships. From volume 2, we hear one of the greatest, most gigantic spirits of the British realm is James I. James I brings in a new element by continuously inoculating into the substance of the British people something that they will have forever, something that they must not lose if they are not to fall utterly into materialism. At one point, that's called commercialism. He inoculates. In the German, he says Einimpfen. It's really it really is an injection. They're trying to Einimpfen the whole population of the world at the moment. But here he says James inoculates into the substance of the English-speaking people, I would say, something they must not lose if they're not to fall utterly into commercialism, materialism. So if the riddle was already there before Rudolf Steiner added to it, the riddle was there before, and he just deepens the riddle basically, and we're left going, okay, so this is the consciousness soul age. What's that we have an individual who can carry all of this inside him? He's meant to be a symptomatic figure of our time, or certainly the beginning of it, around the 17th century. So where do we go with that? And I'm just going to give you two more phenomenon which relate to Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare, but I think it's important to know that these three individuals in Britain, they really incarnated pretty much at the same time. They spent their lives, well, James I was born in Scotland, but he came down to London in 1603 and took the English throne in 1603. And when he came to the throne, Shakespeare and Bacon were both working, but their work took significant turns once James I arrived. He supported both of them. Bacon's first work, The Advancement of Learning, was written, the first big scientific work was written 1605. Hamlet's around 1603, probably written a bit before, but I think it was put on stage in 1603. Then the King James Bible, 1605. So these three individuals are in London at the same time. They're born around the same time. They die around the same time. They have a lot to do with each other. But they are extremely different, particularly Francis Bacon and William Shakespeare. And this is just as a way of trying to get hold of this challenge of James having these totally opposite impulses. So just as a way, as a picture almost, let's look at Bacon and Shakespeare. Bacon, you could say, is the founder of modern natural materialistic science, which obviously we couldn't not have. It was a development that had to come into the world, there's no question. And a lot of everything we have wouldn't be here, the good and the bad, as it were. However, just as with what we have today with the technology or whatever, to suggest that there are no major negatives in what Bacon brought into the world would be ludicrous, frankly. And because I know that most of you have a long-term connection to Rudolf Steiner's work, I'll just plunge in, if that's all right. But this is a passage perhaps some of you know. This is what Rudolf Steiner spoke at the very end of his life, when he was able to speak about the previous lives of different individuals in his karmic relationships lectures. And he speaks about what happened after Francis Bacon's death in the spiritual world, which, even if you know it, is quite challenging. After Bacon had passed through the gate of death, it happened that because of the particular mode of thinking he had adopted in his incarnation as Bacon, a whole world of idols, in inverted commas, demonic idols, went forth from his etheric body and spread themselves out in the spiritual world. Bacon's mode of thinking on earth worked so shatteringly into the spiritual world that it was flooded by a whole host of idols. The individualities who had once lived on earth as Alexander the Great and Aristotle set themselves to fight these demonic idols. In other places, he talks about them having to sort of cleanse the spiritual realms, atmosphere of what had come there through Francis Bacon. So, it's challenging to suggest there's not a negative coming through Bacon would be, as I said before, slightly ludicrous if you take that seriously. And then we have Shakespeare, on the other hand, who is probably one of the most loved human beings on earth. At least, sorry to keep referring to the present time, but in the good old days before the beginning of 2020, when we could still think of Shakespeare or going to the theatre, I think Shakespeare was man of the year more times than one can remember. He's loved over the world by all ages and all sorts of people. It's a very different character. It's like the life, it's just abundant life in Shakespeare, and colour and variety. And Bacon, we needed. We have needed science, but there's no doubt there's also working with the sort of death principle, if you like, as well. So we have life and death in these two individuals, I would say. And to deepen the riddle further, it's all riddles around the beginning of the 17th century, as is Christian Rosenkreutz. I'm sure you know that outside anthroposophy, there are very, very few people who would seriously imagine Christian Rosenkreutz to have been a real individual. For many people, he's either doesn't exist or is a sort of mythological figure, or so again, it's a riddle. It's like a huge riddle of identity around the time of the beginning of the 17th century. And it's added to one more step when Rudolf Steiner says, again in the Karmic Relationships lectures, that behind Shakespeare and Bacon and two other individuals, Jacob Boehme and someone called Jacob Balder, behind these four individuals was the same initiate working, that they were all inspired by the same initiate. Perhaps I can, just because they're complex, these things, perhaps there was one initiate who really spoke through all four, hence their kinship, for in reality, it all goes back to one and the same source. So Shakespeare and Bacon have the same source, which is pretty challenging when I've just described the difference between them. How is that possible that these two can have the same source, the same initiate behind them? And I'm not going to explore this further, because this is explored. That's what the whole book is about, trying to explore this. And maybe some of you know this book, or if you're interested, you can read it. But what I describe in there is that there have been many people, or a number of people, let's say, over the years, who have just thought, oh, well, who could this initiate be behind Shakespeare and Bacon, and have jumped rather quickly to the view that, oh, perhaps this was Christian Rosenkreutz. And then that view is sort of spread around, and if you look around, you'll find this view stated quite often. But it's quite hard, I think, to imagine Christian Rosenkreutz directly inspiring a being who then causes this havoc in the spiritual world that I just described from this lecture. So after a lot of work and a lot of living with it, actually, just living with this riddle and staying open to it. Steiner, when he speaks about it, speaks in a very English way, which is rather wonderful, in that he doesn't fix anything. There's a lot of open spaces between things he says. And just with living with those open spaces for a long time, at a certain point, it became clear to me that the individual he's speaking about, given certain qualifications, is James I. The qualifications are that Steiner said that when he's referring to the initiate behind them, he says that, it's not quite the words, but he almost says that if he were to give the name of this person, people would be put off by the earthly personality in life. He says, because like many a modern initiate, he was in life a rather troublesome fellow, person with great difficulties. So were he to say it, people would go, well, not that person, surely. And Steiner is at pains to speak about actually what's working through him rather than the sort of earthly personality in life, the person who spoke and wrote, but actually what was working through him. And as I mentioned, there are places where Steiner talks about him as an initiate. And it, over the years, as I say, you can explore it more in the book if you're interested, but I'm not going to say more to back it up, but it you know, that became clear, and it was quite a journey to try and share it and be challenged by a number of people who all thought it was actually Christian Rosenkreutz. It was a whole process at the time, but nonetheless, I personally stand fully behind that picture. And I also stand behind it because I think it's incredibly important, the individuality of James I, what the riddle actually says, which is very different than if, oh, well, they must both be the most wonderful, thoroughly imbued Rosicrucian individuals. There's a different riddle inside this than just some big sort of wash where everybody's the same and all in harmony with each other. And I will try and just open that up a little for you. I'll try and open it up, and then at the end I'll share a bit more about some of the sort of, I would call it the opposition, some of the alternative differing views that come in. And then at the end, I hope I'll have time. I think I will. I'd like to share something that's arisen since the book, actually, which is quite nice, that it's not just going back to what I worked on sort of some years ago. But how can we make sense of this? How do we make sense of this Ein infant, that this, well, once we take this initiate behind Shakespeare and Bacon as James I, and then we also hear that James I inoculated into the British people substance of the English-speaking people, something they must never lose. You know, we can start to look at what that is. What is this? What can it be? This picture of inoculation. What can that be? And if you look at Hamlet as I see it almost as a sort of Rosetta Stone of this whole story, Hamlet, written just as James is coming to the throne, and Hamlet is not at all, I would say, someone who doesn't know anything at all about the Baconian world conception that's coming in. Hamlet's whole issue is that he knows that very well, and it's actually knocked him off completely. There's a passage, I'm not going to, it might not be by heart, but you know, one of the most well-known passages in Hamlet is, oh, what a piece of work is a man. But what's really important about that passage is that it shows that there's, although there's the most wonderful plot in Hamlet, all about Hamlet's father having been killed by his uncle, you know, and it's a great thing, and everybody's gripped by it, hopefully, although it's a long play when they go to the theatre. But when the two characters, interestingly called Rosenkreutz and Guildenstern, come and they're sent as spies to interrogate Hamlet, because he knows too much, basically. Hamlet knows what's going on, and so he's a danger, as unfortunately still happens today with some people who know too much. But and these two are sent to probe him to see what he knows, and they go on, and then finally Hamlet says, and I can't quote it, but look it up yourself, it's so wonderful. He says, do you want me to tell you what it is? I'll tell you what the whole thing is, which is why the king's upset and is why everything. Do you want to know the reason? And then he says, I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth, forgone all custom of exercise. This, what is it? I'm sure Ken and other people know it. This goodly earth, what is it to me but a sterile promontory? This wonderful firmament, what is it but a pestilent congregation of vapors? And about the glory of man, the paragon of animals, what is this quintessence of dust? When he tells them what it isn't about Claudius at all. It's about, because his whole relationship as the world shifted. And he's crushed by it at some level. I mean, how do you live after that when everything was once alive and full, and it's been reduced to this quintessence of dust. And another very famous line from Hamlet is, the time is out of joint. O cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right. I have to do something about this to transform it. Forgive the sort of analogy, but what I would say is that Hamlet swallowed the poison, if you like. And then the question is, can the immune system work on it? Can he win himself back to health again? Because he can't get it out of the system. That's all changed, this quintessence of dust. But oh, cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right. And a process starts in Shakespeare of, how do I deal with this? Can we come to a healthy way forward after we have ingested this? And he does. If you follow Shakespeare's work, it goes on, through all the tragedies, through the wrestling with all the evil, you could say, that also comes into our epoch. And then we finally get to the late plays where actually you could say the pearl comes about, having taken in the pain. The pearl is finally fashioned and formed. And we have these beautiful late plays with these young beings. I know some people couldn't see it, but if you look at that Faust sketch in the Goetheanum, you see that young child coming from the future. And that's just what you see in the late plays of Shakespeare. Again and again, they meet this young, sort of, it's often a woman of sort of pure female figure who comes, and this sort of older male figure is transformed in the meeting with that somehow. So this sort of transformation occurs through Shakespeare. But where I'm trying to get to is that it is to do with having taken this poison, let's call it, ingested it. In The Winter's Tale, this is Shakespeare's second last play, there's an absolutely extraordinary image where Leontes, who's raving, I won't go into the whole story, but he does this image where he says, if you have a glass of water and it has a spider in it, and you drink it, but you don't know there's a spider in it, you're fine, because you don't know what's just happened. And Leontes says, but I have seen the spider. Yeah, I've drunk and I've seen it as well. And that's like Shakespeare too. I've drunk it and I've seen it. I'm not naive anymore. But not for Leontes, although Leontes is also transformed by the end. But for Shakespeare, it's the process, okay, I've seen the spider, but can I transform it as well? And what I'd like to do with these two, with Bacon and Shakespeare, is just to take you to the end of their work, to see, where Bacon's work reaches to and where Shakespeare's work reaches to. And then I hope you can, see the difference, and then you also see what Shakespeare's doing and where Bacon's reached to. Bacon's last work, maybe he didn't write it the last, but it was published posthumously in 1626, I think. He died in 1626, and it was published that year. It's a very famous little work called The New Atlantis. And it was an unfinished document piece. And at the end of it, if you can see it here, that's the story finishes here. And then there's these little sentences here, which are sort of an add-on in a way. And my feeling is they're inspired sentences. We're talking about still the first quarter of the 17th century. I wouldn't say positively inspired, but inspired from the future. So he talks, in my own words, about genetics, about the prolongation of life, about how we can do what everyone's trying to do now to see if we don't have to get ill and die. We can just go on living for much longer, about weather modification. So I'll just read you some of these. The first one is the prolongation of life, the curing of diseases counted incurable, the altering of complexions, the altering of features, versions of bodies into other bodies. I would call that some kind of genetics, versions of bodies into other bodies, transplanting of one species into another, instruments of destruction, of war and poison, acceleration of time, impressions of the air and raising of tempests. I would call that weather modification. Deceptions of the senses, greater pleasures of the senses. And then it finishes artificial minerals and cements. And that's the last word of Bacon's oeuvre, in a way, is cements, because it's this unpublished work. But that's, perhaps a bit unfair. I haven't gone into the whole Bacon's work of the whole methodology of natural science, but it's extraordinary finishes with this. As a person, you don't have to believe me. I see that as some sort of inspiration comes in of future possibilities, comes into him. So that's Bacon, New Atlantis. It's on an island. I'll tell you later, but because of certain similarities, there are people who think that New Atlantis and The Tempest must have been written by the same person, because they're both on islands and they both involve things like this sort of magic and raising of tempests and things. But they're actually very, very different indeed. But the New Atlantis does take place on this island. There's the sort of center of science, and then they go out from this island and sort of colonize the world and basically bring this work in this sort of brotherhood of scientists to the rest of the world. The Tempest, Shakespeare's last work, also on an island. I hope, many, if not most, if not all, have had seen The Tempest in some form somewhere. So I'm not just speaking into, that you don't have pictures for it, but I think one of the biggest things of all about The Tempest is conscience, actually. All the people arrive who are all part of this big crime that's happened, the whole sort of wound, if you like, in Shakespeare, which all has its way of working, and the assault on someone else. It has the Cain Abel story in Shakespeare, this sort of, one brother is effectively sort of killing or trying to usurp the other brother. There's a whole terrible wound that's taken place. And all of these people arrive on this island where Prospero is, and they have to go through a catharsis or a karma loka, or they have to be shriven. It's part of it. They're faced with conscience. So that's a big aspect of it, which I would also see as part of this, this wrestling with the poison. Can it be transformed, this thing, or is it just going to go on causing havoc, or can it actually be taken in and transformed? There's this, well, I don't know if it's a central moment, but I see it as a central moment in The Tempest, where Prospero is this great magician, gives it all up. This, this extraordinary speech where he shares all of his magic, and again, like Bacon mentioned, his ability to raise tempests and raise the dead and do everything and call up all the elementals. And then he says, "But this rough magic I here abjure. And when I have required some heavenly music, which even now I do, I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book." It's if they get it right in the theatre, it's very, very powerful. If not, they just have to try and act it as best they can. But if you get it right, it's an extraordinary act of renunciation that takes place. It's like, what's happened now? Something's been reached, and now it's all been given up. And I think this rough magic's very important. I would almost go so far as to call it like a kind of scientific magic. It's not. We'd have to be thrown into our own times. But Bacon's talking about a scientific magic. This, I give it all up. It goes back to nothing. I hope it's all right to say it's almost like we take it to the altar or something, and then see what may come in the future if that's given up. And with that quality of conscience or something else other than what's normally given as science, I would say that in that process, 200 years later, Goethe's writing, it's more or less exactly 200 years later. So 200 years later, the balance between the science and art isn't this very difficult polarity of this sort of two quite different things. Goethe's actually able to sort of harmonize that and take it further, create a, you know, a science also of the living, not just of the dead world. Yeah. And then the art's affected by it too, something that can go on and, as we know, then eventually become anthroposophy and spiritual science. I think there's a path through what happens with Prospero that leads on into the future to Goethe, to the Romantics, not just Goethe, to Blake and all the other wonderful figures in the Romantic time. There's another aspect to that renunciation, which perhaps I can't read you the whole passage, but for those who are interested in the lectures Rosicrucianism and Modern Initiation in January 1924, there's a new edition now on these nice American collected works editions, but it's in lecture 3. Steiner speaks about such an act of renunciation of the old wisdom. It was in a simple gathering of the Rosicrucians that on the occasion of a ritual arranged for the purpose, this was in the latter half of the 15th century, man's knowledge of the stars was in a deeply solemn manner offered up for a season. Yeah, it's necessary that higher knowledge be offered up for a season. And then there's an interesting remark of Steiner's that, sorry, it's hard for me to find it when I'm talking. Whatever in the years that followed showed itself to be of a truly spiritual nature was a kind of echo sounding on of this creative working. Side by side with external materialism, we can always find here and there individuals who are living under the influence of that renunciation of higher knowledge. So I've just given you Shakespeare. We're back early, we're back to the 15th century, but Steiner talks about this act of renunciation that happened at one particular gathering. It's extraordinary. I only realized that today, I have to say. And that all true work that followed, you know, really in the right spirit, stood under the influence of that action. And again, you know, you have to live with it and see whether it resonates for yourself. But over the years, my sense is that Shakespeare's The Tempest is in that stream. It absolutely resonates with that act of renunciation for a season, so that it can come back, so that actually we can win our freedom and then can re-find it in a new way, you know, to a large degree through anthroposophy, when Rosicrucianism can be refound and become public. So what happens in The Tempest leads on, I would say, to the Romantics and Goethe, and leads on to, you know, has this Rosicrucian connection too very deeply, that then also leads on to anthroposophy. And to the possibility for actually redemption, or redemption's the wrong word, sorry, for a transformation of everything, as in anthroposophy, of culture, of science, of the arts, of medicine, of the state even. You know, it leads on to that possibility. And, you know, Bacon, I mean, he played a huge role. And I think it's fair to say that you know, the work that happens, even in Shakespeare's work, wouldn't have been what it was without this process of having to take that in and develop it. So we have to wrestle with that, but it's a tough thing we have to wrestle with. And if that tough thing just goes on in its own direction, we're in for trouble. You know, that's the big task we have. It's a crossroads. Do we just go the one thing on its own that goes rampantly on, or are we able to actually bring it in a different way? I think one very significant thing, those who know The Tempest will be very aware of Caliban, this strange sort of almost sort of animal human figure, Caliban, who is very extraordinary because he causes Prospero all sorts of problems. He tries to kill him in the middle of the play, and it's a huge issue for Prospero wrestling with him. But at the very end of the play, when someone says, who's this Caliban figure? Prospero says, this thing of darkness, I acknowledge mine. I acknowledge this. Yeah, I take this on. This is part of it. We have to self-knowledge. The Tempest is all about self-knowledge. And the Antonio figure is the one who actually, the Cain figure in the story, who sort of usurped his brother, cast him out, sees Caliban and says, oh, we'll be able to make good money out of him. We'll take him back and we'll, sell him in a freak show or use him or something. We will be able to get money from this. Well, if Caliban is a picture of the double, it's a very interesting question. Do you take it on, acknowledge it mine, and work with that and transform it? Or do you say, yeah, we can make good money out of the double? So there's a crossroads there. And I think when you go into Steiner's work, he couldn't be clearer about the crossroads. He calls Bacon the utterly British philosopher. Yeah, it's a path that will take you, to the West. I mean, the West has its role and it's wonderful, and many of you are from there. But it's the West. There's a middle as well, and there's an East, and if the West in its right form would love to have a healthy middle that allows it to then find its own health. The picture Steiner paints and this picture we're in to a large degree at the moment, the West just going off on its own and saying, I'm not interested in all of this transformation stuff and conscience and all of that. We're just going to go full on and develop what is there at the end of the New Atlantis. And I think we're okay. Time, extraordinary. I didn't know I would be, but I think we're okay. Yeah, that could be, that could be a nice or a nice or even not nice picture of Shakespeare and Bacon, and do we go this way or do we go this way? And that could just be something one could think about and talk about, and it wouldn't necessarily you know what I mean, be a living reality, that opposition. But the unfortunate thing is that it is a living reality. So this is also an aspect I devote at least one chapter of the book, this theme, which I imagine many of you will encounter in some form, either very intensely or just have heard about it in a small way. But the fact of there being a connection between Bacon and Shakespeare, Rudolf Steiner talks about one initiate having inspired both of them. The fact, for example, that in the Tempest in New Atlantis, there are similarities, kind of, as I say, they're both on an island, they both involve magic to some degree. I mean, the many people who would go say, this is nonsense. Well, sorry, I'm struggling for words for the first time, having to speak about this oppositional aspect. But there are a lot of people in the world. It's held very strongly still within the Freemasonic movement and in a lot of popular spiritualish literature, claim that Shakespeare was a fraud and that his works were actually written by Francis Bacon. Rudolf Steiner spoke about this at the end of the 19th century, 1880 or something. I mean, it's been around for a long time. It's been around since about 20 years after Bacon's death. This strange story, it's very strange because from where I'm coming from, it's like a usurping, it's like a spiritual usurping gesture that Shakespeare was actually sort of nobody and uneducated, uncultured, didn't travel, and Bacon was the educated figure, the cultural aristocratic figure who traveled the world, or the cultured world to some degree. So Shakespeare couldn't have known about all the things he wrote about. So it must have been Francis Bacon who wrote it. And that could be a little literary sort of game, but for myself, and I trust for many of you, it becomes not a game when what that means for people who hold to that is that Bacon was also Christian Rosenkreutz. Because I don't know if you can see this. This is a rather simple drawing by myself, but this is the West and the middle and the East. This is this child coming from the East. I put in 1604. So you have Christian Rosenkreutz in the middle. Jacob Böhme is also in the middle. And then we have James I as a central figure in Western culture, without question. Steiner calls him a gigantic spirit of the Western world. And these two figures, Bacon, who he calls the very British, and Shakespeare, who Steiner says that what James I inoculates, which we must never lose, is connected by deep underground channels to all the true culture of Central Europe. So in that picture, I mean, it's not terribly well done, but you know, there's a connection, and it connects here. And Shakespeare's work certainly strongly connects. The picture of this is absolutely extraordinary. This is Bacon is Shakespeare, and Bacon is also Christian Rosenkreutz. You know, it's all Bacon. That, to put it strongly, you know, there is no real Central European culture. Bacon was behind the whole lot, which might sound nuts, but if you read what these people say, that's what they say. They say he was also Johann Valentin André. So he was also the author of the Rosicrucian manifestos. It's a really odd game, you could call it, that someone just becomes everybody. In Blake's work, you have these four Zoas. They're the four sort of great spiritual realities in North, East, West, and South. And one of them, called Urizen, tries to usurp the places of all the others. Says, you know, I basically want control of the whole thing. And Blake's work is of it having to sort of wrestle back that Urizen can have his place, but he doesn't suddenly have to be everywhere. And yes, I'm struggling a bit because it's a huge theme, and it's also very challenging, and it's taken very seriously. There's a historian called Frances Yates, who maybe many of you know. There's a book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. She's been a very, I don't know if she still is, but she's been a very influential historian, because she went into, that book's called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. She went into the sort of Rosicrucian background of the time, of the 17th century, and made it, made it acceptable in historical discourse to really discuss the Rosicrucian movement in the beginning of the 17th century. But when she speaks about Christian Rosenkreutz, although the book's called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, she says, well, this was just a mythological creation, Christian Rosenkreutz. The reality was the work of Francis Bacon, which means his scientific work, and also he's seen very strongly, and maybe he was, as having a huge influence within the Freemasonic movement, being in a way the founder of the Freemasonic movement at that time, as well as having strong political power as well, and being credited with having painted the blueprint for the creation of the United States of America and the New Atlantis. So as I say, this is just one symptom of Bacon being brought into like the historical discourse as being behind all of this Rosicrucian, the whole Rosicrucian impulse. If it's dear to you, and if it matters that the 1413 one has Christian Rosenkreutz as at the foundation of it, you know, that is of great and incredibly troubling concern, that usurping somehow. And just so I can only give you a couple of examples, so you know I'm not just inventing it. I'll read to you from Annie Besant, who Rudolf Steiner had so I'm struggling for words, but what I'm speaking about, Rudolf Steiner engaged with strongly with Annie Besant, this whole question of the role of Central Europe, not out of any remote kind of nationalism, not in the slightest. He says the point about Central Europe is the place where it's easiest not to connect with one's nation. That's Steiner's picture of Central Europe. He says Goethe, is great because because it's possible for him not to be nationalistic in that way. But yes, and so Rudolf Steiner spoke with Annie Besant and spoke about the origins of the Rosicrucian movement in Central Europe, and Annie Besant said it's not true. The origins are all in the West, with people like John Dee and Francis Bacon. And Steiner speaks about this in letters. You can read them, and at the end he says, what can one say if this is their view that actually it all started in the West? And I don't know if Steiner knew this, he probably did, to be honest, but Annie Besant in 1912, she does credit Christian Rosenkreutz with an existence. He was a real being, but he reincarnated as Francis Bacon for Annie Besant. So she said, this individuality was known as the Comte de Saint-Germain in the 18th century, as Francis Bacon in the 17th century, and as Christian Rosenkreutz in the 14th century. So that's Annie Besant, 1912, Rudolf Steiner's alive, saying Christian Rosenkreutz then incarnates as Francis Bacon and then incarnates as the Comte de Saint-Germain. So what I was describing before, like this sort of history and this strange picture of usurping, if you look at esoterically, you find that this is stated. And other people, Alice Bailey too, says exactly the same thing. Don't need to quote it, and a number of other people. So it's quite a big issue. It's a really big issue, and this is an aside, but I hope it'll be of interest to some of you. Is that today, and what we're facing today, it's actually wonderful. There's a lot of people who are encountering the work of Rudolf Steiner because of things he said, particularly the one extraordinary remark about vaccinations and, what can the intention of a vaccination to separate people from the spiritual world so they won't be able to have a connection to the spiritual world. This has gone around, and there's a lot of people I know from friends in Germany, who've really started to ask about Rudolf Steiner. There's also the other thing of Rudolf Steiner being attacked like never before, because he's seen as problematic, not going in the same direction that the powers that be are wanting to go in. But nonetheless, at the same time, with Rudolf Steiner being so foregrounded as a problem, people are also becoming interested in him. And there's at least one person I know, he's from America, who is actually a wonderful researcher and has a channel. He's quite popular and speaks about Rudolf Steiner. So that feels great. I say, wonderful. And he speaks about Ahriman, and it's like, great. And then he has one video where it's about Rudolf Steiner and Francis Bacon. And well, I hope he could come to sort of see how Rudolf Steiner looked at this question, because at the moment he's just picked up the picture of Bacon being this amazing figure who's actually Christian Rosenkreutz, and how America is the sort of center of things. Rather than, I'm not raising a flag for Central Europe, but if you just go into, if you think about Christian Rosenkreutz and you think about the German idealists, Novalis and Goethe and Schiller and Hegel and Fichte and Schelling, and then Rudolf Steiner, the spiritual substance of Central Europe, that's so needed and can then bring real health also to the West. And so I hope, what I'm saying is, I hope as people also realize that, what Steiner can bring, that people can also solve this strange thing about Bacon, because that is not the solution to the riddle. Just Bacon was everybody. The way I understand it is that what happens with James I and also with Shakespeare, like the true culture, and others, Blake and Shelley and whoever, the real spiritual source and wants to choose, Carl Koenig or whoever one might choose. I know he wasn't English, but he spent his time in the British-speaking world, is that the true culture of the West, it's an image, holds hands, is able to hold hands with Christian Rosenkreutz. There's an image, but at its truest place. That's what you get in the Tempest. The Tempest comes to the place where there's even the words, if you know them. There's the marriage of Ferdinand and Miranda, like the sort of the young king and queen. And when we see them, there's a veil is removed, and we see them, and they're playing chess together. There's a picture in the Tempest where there's, in this cave, a curtain's unveiled, and we see this beautiful young male and female, Ferdinand and Miranda, playing chess. Well, in the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz, which is, I think, written in 1604, you have the same image, but it's not now on a stage. It really is this young king and queen, and literally a veil is, it's unveiled, and they're playing at a game like unto chess. So we've come to the place by the end of Shakespeare's work where he's absolutely aligned with Rosicrucianism. And James I has a part of him, I would say the part that worked through Shakespeare and Burma, that part that we must never lose, which is able to be totally aligned with all the true culture of Central Europe. And then there's the other part, the Bacon part, which is problematic if it just heads off on its own, unbridled, as it were. So that's some picture of this sort of opposition that goes on, because it's widespread and it's popular, and it's difficult to somehow find a way into this, but it's critical, I think, if we're to find a way to actually, for things to be able to be dealt with healthily. And I'd now just like to share one more picture. I hope it's all right. I asked Andrea if I could speak until 8:30, and then we could have time for questions. And this is something that's actually not in the book. It's arisen sort of in the years since, and relates, I think, to today with this whole strange story of Shakespeare, Bacon, James I, and Christian Rosenkreutz. Is, like any good riddle, the more you unravel it, the more the more questions open up. And there's still a question. So what's it all about? I mean, I hope I've shared something about what it's about. But this James I individual, I really appreciated. Before you came on, I spoke with Andre, and Andre spoke about James I as so important in his sort of humanness, as not being the great hero figure. He's sort of, who's James I in the history books? He's some strange guy. Even the historians at the time said his clothes didn't fit properly, and he sort of didn't walk very well, and he was Scottish, so he couldn't speak very well. It was awkward. Yeah, and I love that you brought this sort of human aspect of James I, which is true. So in a sense, he's also a real representative of the consciousness soul. We're here with all our oddities. But on an inner level, what's actually living through him, this initiate aspect that's living in him. What is that that he can stand behind these two different figures? I spoke about the poison and overcoming the poison. That's fine, but it's still a riddle. What kind of destiny is that, to have those two? And what I'm sharing, just as with everything else, just live with it, and if it resonates, it resonates, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. But after many years of living with it, I was reading Rudolf Steiner about the Templars, the Order of the Knights Templar, who were eradicated in 1314, finally, in France, not in Portugal, but as you know, in Europe. And Steiner speaks quite a bit about the Templars, and there's masses and masses of literature about this. The Templars, they have a sort of strong call somehow. And I'm also saying this because some people have related James I in different ways to the Templars. Karl Koenig gives some lectures on James I, and the first one's all about the Templars. He doesn't quite say why, but in order to speak about James I, he speaks about the Templars beforehand. And when you read Steiner about the Templars, forgive me, I'm struggling just because it's very profound material, but as I'll speak as if some of you don't know it, but Steiner describes how at the core of the Templars, there was, I don't know how large a group, maybe it was small, there were people who really underwent a true Christian initiation at the core of the Templars. And that there were, and the intention, if you like, for that Christian initiation was for the transformation of European culture, that something could really flow in to bring about a transformation within Europe going into the future. Sorry for not mentioning America, but it wasn't around much at the time. Tiny bit, but not much. And Steiner speaks about a kind of jealousy, like a kind of Ahrimanic jealousy of this transformative Christian initiation principle that could actually develop within Europe. So there was this, vicious attack set on it to a large degree through this individual, Philip the Fair, Philip IV of France. And then they, as you know, they were arrested and executed. The whole order was eradicated and tortured in horrible ways. And Steiner speaks about the most demonic aspect of it was that the Templars could actually confess to things they never did. So what the evil powers, if you like, were accusing them of, they were actually brought under extreme conditions of torture to actually confess to them. So they spoke the kind of words of the other side, if you like, just call it the other side for the moment. And then Steiner then speaks about particularly this core of individuals. He refers to 53 knights who were knights in their life on earth in the spiritual world. And something hugely transformative did nonetheless flow into European culture through them after death. There was incredibly fruitful, transformative stream that came from these 53. But in the same moment, Steiner speaks about the development of this sort of Ahrimanic attack as well. And then he also speaks about the fact that, that through the mouths of these highly developed individuals, also the Ahrimanic powers also spoke. It's very complex. And of course, if one says Ahrimanic, one can go, but which one does? But it had a role. It had a role. This is before the consciousness soul age started, which is 1314. And in coming to grips with this age, this had to come in. It's very difficult. Steiner at one point says, many people might ask, why did such a thing have to happen? Why did the Templars have to go through this awful tortures? And Steiner, to paraphrase, almost says, one actually can't ask these sort of questions in relation to what evolution contains and what's asked of the human beings. It's just not quite fitting to ask this kind of question. And the way I understand that is because it's part of the challenge of the consciousness soul age, that then after that we have to deal with these two streams. We have to, Steiner's very clear that this attack on the Templars developed then into materialistic natural science. When Rudolf Steiner talks about Henry VIII, he's very clear, he speaks about him in relation to the Templars, that this stream of materialism, that was sort of, with which the Templars were attacked, then lives on in someone like Henry VIII, and I'd say lives on in the work of Francis Bacon, which has to come into the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, not the has to come into our age. That's what we have to wrestle with. I'm sure many of you know that Steiner says that the fourth epoch, what he calls the Greco-Roman epoch, the human beings had to wrestle with the mystery of death. The whole wrestle, and, which they did, is when the mystery of Golgotha occurs. And then in our epoch, he says we have to wrestle with the mystery of evil. So we couldn't be spared it. So these two streams come in. And there's still this transformative principle. Steiner says that Goethe's fairy tale, well, he talks about its Rosenkreutz connection, he talks about its connection with anthroposophy, but he also says that when Steiner's speaking about the Templars and this true source springing from the Templars after death, he speaks about Goethe's fairy tale and says Goethe knew the secret of the Templars, which I understand to mean that really fruitful source also springs into Goethe's work. And then in Steiner's mystery dramas, we suddenly find the Templars. It works on in a positive way. But we have both. And then this strange thing that he almost says out of the same mouth. And I've no idea, I don't have karmic perception, but it wouldn't surprise me if one discovered that James I, as Karl Koenig sort of intimates, actually has a profound connection to the Templars, the sort of Western initiation stream, where this double mystery is there. There's, on the one hand, the sort of natural science, the Francis Bacon element, power and all of this, and then what can actually transform it also, the other side, the Shakespeare side. And as perhaps you know, it's finishing after this, so you can have a breather and ask some questions if you want, or just go. But the last picture into this, but we're coming into where we are now, as if we ever left it. I'm sure many of you know that actually only at the very end of his life, when he was speaking to the priests, the new priests of the Christian community, in the lectures Rudolf Steiner gave in 1924 in September on the book of Revelation to the priests, he speaks about this, the sort of Christ's greatest adversary, if you like, the sun demon, who sees it as his task to basically oppose the Christ being. Sorad, as he names him. Yeah, and I'm sure there's no one here listening who isn't aware of that description, and that Sorad has a number, and the number is the number of a man, is 666. And then Steiner speaks about the date, and he talks about 666, and he refers to the influence streaming in through the Arabic world at the time around 666, when, as I understand it, Muawiyah was the caliph, I think, in 666. You need to check it, but what was coming in as a sort of opposition to the Christ impulse. And then Steiner goes 666 years later to 1332, which is actually, slightly after the Templars, who were, these ones were killed in 1314. So it's, what is it? 1332, it's 18 years later or something. But when Steiner speaks about the second attack of Sorad, he speaks about 1332, and he speaks of the Templars. So that whole Angriff in German, that attack, which I've described through this torture of the Templars and bringing this about, that they would sort of speak against themselves. If you go deeper, Steiner also calls this, the Sorathic attack. That has the gesture of that anti-sun being. And then, as I'm sure many are aware, he says, and then you add another 666 years, and you come to 1998, and which is basically now. I'm not going to go into this one, but you can certainly, if you look back to a lot of things, you can see the origins of what's happening now in 1998, and in many ways quite specifically, actually. But let's just take it that we're in that time period now. And again, I'd say it's not only something to kind of go about and panic, but what does it actually ask of us? And you see what it asked of the Templars. It asked that they were tortured and killed, and went through that, and hope that's not going to happen with us. But it's still very powerful, very, very powerful. We don't know where it's going to go to, but what I'm wanting to get to is that this riddle of Bacon, if that's true, that within James the First lives both of these things, lives like the poison and then the overcoming of it. Yeah, it's important that one knows that. Someone who says, oh, well, Bacon and Shakespeare are just the same is ludicrous. It doesn't help us at all. It's all a great mishmash. If you know, okay, right, we understand. So this whole scientific direction, if it goes off like this, the whole technological direction, is problematic, and we're actually called on to do something else. We're called on to recognize that and then to develop, in a rightful direction. That's what happened with the Templars. Yeah, they didn't just mix it all together. There were two impulses that came out of that. Yes, the one stream and the transformative one. And if we're in a sort of repetition to some degree of that, we're asked the same thing. I would say more consciously, to actually recognize what's involved, what the evil is involved, what the huge danger. That's what we're called on to do. We recognize the work of Ahriman and Sorath and see it. And if we do that, then we can start to develop something different. And I don't know if everybody's of the same view, but I see it as very problematic when people say, oh, well, it's all okay, really. It's not okay. It's not okay at all. And but if we recognize that's the task, okay, we have to see this, and then we can transform. I think we have a chance. That's what I would understand Steiner to say, which I quoted at the very beginning, when he says we will face this medical tyranny, this kind of, this Jesuitic principle tyranny, until we wake up to what the true challenges of the consciousness soul age. It's a trial. He says 3 times in that lecture, it's a trial, Prüfungen, that we have to overcome. And part of it is to recognize, okay, at least we can see what the evil is. And if we're clear about that, we can then try and bring about something different. That would be to sort of pass the trial, as I understand it. That's one thing. Another thing is, I'm just closing up now. Another thing is, I've mentioned it already, about the challenge of our age being to do with the wrestling with evil. But another quote from Rudolf Steiner, if I can only, yes, I found it. Thus, this is Rudolf Steiner, thus by a strange paradox, humanity is led to a renewed experience of the mystery of Golgotha in the present epoch through the forces of evil. Thus, by a strange paradox, humanity is led to a renewed experience of the mystery of Golgotha in the present epoch through the forces of evil. So it's, it's part of it all, I'm afraid, is this meeting this. It is part of it. And if we were able to get it right, large scale, that's where it should lead to. Also to what he just describes there. And I will finish with a thought for you, which is, if you think of these words that at the end of Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which I described as a kind of inspiration from the future, I think we have a lot of that going on at the moment. If you know Ray Kurzweil, the sort of founder of the whole transhumanist project, in his book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, at the end of the book, he has a timeline. He wrote it in the 90s, and the timeline goes on 100 years, and he describes exactly what will happen. And he says it's not just a prediction, because he's an inventor, so it's actually based on what's happening. And for him, around about 2040 or something, we will merge with machines, and he describes the stages up to that and where it'll go. And we do have a lot of that. We're told, we're constantly being given pictures of where things are going and how awful it's going to be and how we're going to be totally stuck into this sort of Ahrimanic universe. And that's also a phenomenon we're having to face. I would like to remind you of a moment in Rudolf Steiner's mystery dramas, in the third mystery drama, which is very interesting because Ahriman tells everybody that he's got the whole of humanity under his grasp, and he's got it in his control. He's got these 12 people on the stage. He says, I've got them, and because I've got them, I've got everybody. And then he walks up to the audience. The people on stage can't hear it. And he says to the audience, Ahriman, I don't actually have them all in my power. I want to, but I don't, because the earth doesn't allow me to. But I will keep on trying. And it's a very, very important moment. Because my understanding is that that's part of Ahriman's game, is to give these pictures as if the future's already here and there's no way out of it. And I think we're asked to do something different, which is a different relationship to the future. We do have to create the future. That version of Ahriman isn't creating it, it's being given to us. But we're actually called on to create it. Very, very clear when Steiner, I think it relates to climate change myself, the fact that the climate's not allowed to change. But Steiner speaks about the law of the conservation of matter. And he says this law is completely opposed to what's actually asked of us and what is needed if the earth is to be able to go forward, and humanity, which is we, out of our ideals and our creativity, have to create the future ourselves, which maybe does start with pictures and initiatives and impulses, but that's what we have to do, and the future will be built out of that. You see, so it's opposed to this. It's like two inspirations of the future, and one is this one that's being, thrown at us, and the other one is for us to say, actually, it's up to us to take it on and build it. And I'll finish with a last little quotation from Rudolf Steiner about Shakespeare, because I think what he's saying is that Shakespeare, this, the greatest creative artist of the Western world, if you like, has this power of creativity. That's what he says we can get from Shakespeare. Steiner gave these lectures to quite an advanced group of people in Oxford. They were all about education, and it was on the new ideals. And halfway through the lecture, Steiner kind of says, there's really not much point in talking about new ideals. We've got thousands of new ideals. It's the easiest thing in the world for people to come up with new ideals. He says, what we need is the actual creative power to actually manifest them and bring them alive. And then he says, and that is what you can learn from Shakespeare. His dramatic characters don't come about in any intellectual way, but by living. It is this power that we must seek again. Sorry, the characters of Shakespeare's come not from human intellect, but from a power kindled and fired in the human being. It is this power that we must seek again if we would develop the true ideal of humanity. So it's just an urge for people's creative activity. And that's more or less the talk I wanted to give. And I'm very happy to take some questions if you'd like, or comments or anything.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. Richard, I'm wondering if you can take maybe 2 minutes to take a breath.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, maybe. And we will stretch our legs and have a sip of water, and we will be back in 2-3 minutes. Great. To move in our questions and answers session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, so yes. Well, Richard, you good to continue? All right.
Yes, I'm fine. Yeah, absolutely fine.
Okay, dear friends, we are back. We are back. And if you would like to ask questions, so we will use a chat window. Please do not type whole question, just put your Q. What we need, just your name and your intention to ask a question. Just put a Q and dot. So in this way, we're going to create virtual live, and you will speak lively to Richard and ask question.
Are you going to host it, Andrea? I don't know how to do it. I'm happy to take anything. I don't know how people.
Okay, I mean, if it doesn't work, just ask question. Maybe raise your hand if you want.
Doesn't have to be a question. It might be just a comment.
Okay, okay. We have first person, Julia Perez. Yeah, Julia, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
It's it's Julia and Daniel. We're here.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Daniel.
Well, I just wanted to really thank you through all of the COVID time when we've been doing these Zoom sessions. Most anthroposophists have not spoken to the topic of climate change and inoculation and vaccines, and mentioned these relationships that Steiner brings about the connection of inoculation to separating us from the spiritual. And I just wanted to, it's really more a comment that I wanted to thank you for raising it, because I feel like I've been kind of in the wilderness, you know, where most anthroposophists have embraced the inoculations. And so it's been hard to listen to that and not have another picture. And you really brought another picture that was very rich. So thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. If you don't know it, the magazine New View, I mean, I've written some articles, and a number of other people, you know, have also, since the beginning of COVID, it's had a lot of articles by different people on this theme, and you might be interested if you don't know of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, and I also had a question. I guess what I'm thinking about is this description of Philip the Fair and the coercion of, you know, confessions from the Templars, but the relationship to our modern time of these mini coercions that are happening in the medical field. And what is the impact of these, you know, millions of mini coercions that are happening very quietly in the name of something wholesome or safe, but not that to judge people that want to have this procedure, because I think it's absolutely fine if people want to, but it's the coercion of others. And if you have any suggestions about bringing that to people in a gentle way that's not judgmental, that we can both have our ways of working together. It's very challenging for me to find words around that.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for the question. I can't honestly say that I've got ways to get past that, but what I'm really grateful is you speak about like the small coercions, because the character, you know, with the Templars, it's like an archetype, and it's, you know, back in the past with torches and stuff. But there's something about it. There's something about the whole total distortion of the truth. You know, it's like the opposite, the inversion. You get people saying the exact opposite of what's the actual truth. And I have to say that I see that in all sorts of ways. So I do think that no, we see that spirit. All I can say is that, you know, I think anybody who's connected to anthroposophy, you know, we've been given all the tools to try and perceive the working of let's just call them difficult forces in the world, you know, that don't have humanity's best interests at heart. And that's our task, to see that and then find a way to work different. And maybe someone else has got ways to actually speak to people. I'm afraid I don't. I think it's very challenging, that whole issue of that we're all human beings here together. That's just the reality. And, so, yeah, but thank you.
It was really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Ricardo, you're next. Ricardo.
Yes, Richard, thank you very much for your presentation and your thoughts. I found it very helpful. And I do think there is this claim or statement, demand to have obedience with respect to medicine, the medical intervention, and with what the government says, what public health officials say. Do you think that also is true of science, wanting obedience? Is it a much more subtle level than the outward public health message and what medicine says we should be doing in terms of vaccinations and lockdowns and masking, etc.?
Forgive me, Ricardo. I got slightly distracted. What was the first part? Because you said, is this kind of obedience that's asked from us
Yes.
the same as, what was the very first thing you mentioned?
I said that we have obedience in terms of medical experts saying what we should do, public health officials say what we should do. But is that also true of science? Or is it a false type of science saying about the obedience, we must go through this, we must do this?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say too much more than what I said at the beginning. I mean, you know, I work, well, I did before the pandemic, you know, I work in theater and sort of directing plays and teaching drama, but so for me, the concept of follow the science is, I don't know, I'd love to hear from people who are scientists in some way or work with science. It just doesn't seem a relevant word to use in relation to science, to follow it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, even with Rudolf Steiner, who's someone you really might think would be good to follow, he doesn't ask you to follow him. He asks you to take it on and live with it and test things and come with your own initiative. So maybe historically, I don't know if you're aware of the sort of movement that's partly called scientism with this guy, Auguste Comte. I think he was in the 18th century, but you know, look him up, C-O-M-T-E. And you know, what's very significant is that he said that with the church having lost its authority, he had a Catholic background in the modern age, there needs to be something like that, but it can't be the church. So it would have to be science. So he said the scientists and the industrialists would have to be the new priests, and they would have to be obeyed in the way the church were obeyed before. And I think that's going back to another time, which if it was valid then, it certainly isn't valid now. That's my view.
Yeah, I think you're right about how people use that jargon, follow the science, where that almost always means follow what the authorities say without going into the actual, what does the research say? So follow what the public health officials say, follow what the experts say, what you should know, without really looking at the details. Now, we're not all capable of doing that, but I don't think true scientists are saying that, because there's a lot of controversial and a lot of information and evidence on both sides. And to say follow the science, that usually means, well, the CDC is my authority, which is a captured and corrupted institution, or if the FDA is my authority, they quote, follow the science. It's laughable if you really look at it. It isn't science.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting if they said practice science. If the motto was practice science, what would happen?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alan is next. Alan, please unmute yourself. Alan, are you with us?
can't see Alan. I'm looking for you.
Yeah.
It's not unmuted. I can see him. It's not unmuted. I can see-
Susan, I think Susan is, okay, it's just mostly statement. Milan Lazovic. Milan, I think it's Czech Republic. Or...
Where are you, Milan?
Milan, could you please unmute yourself? Milan.
Oh, pity. I'd love to hear Milan.
Okay, so let's go with Dick Halford. Dick, yes, go ahead.
This is a comment about the Jesuitism. Anthony Fauci says he's a humanist. Okay, he was brought up, he went to Regis High School, a Jesuit high school. Again, he might not be a Jesuit, he may be a humanist, but the principle of Jesuitism is there.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I couldn't agree more. I mean, he gave this lecture. Did you see it at Regis College? He gave a lecture there. It's very, very interesting. And he basically says that I don't know if he says I'm not a Jesuit, I've no idea, but what he absolutely does say is he says that I'm totally in alignment with everything I learned at this college. You know, what I have here is at the core of who I am, what I gained at this college. So, yeah, that's true. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Daniel Liberty. Daniel?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to ask this question about Amos Comenius and the relationship between Amos Comenius and Francis Bacon, just for a particular reason. Today we are living in a very particular situation about science, about what science is. And not so many people talk about education and the question that probably we don't know nothing about science in the right sense, just because we educate in a wrong way. And I was wondering if you have research about this connection between Amos Comenius, that is the father of modern pedagogy, and Francis Bacon. And not just because about what Steiner said in the karmic relationship, but just these two personality, in historical personality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I have researched quite a lot, but not to the place where I can actually say anything. I've lectured quite regularly over the last 10 years or so in Prague. And obviously there's a big interest in Comenius in Prague. And obviously, you know, people have asked, I've spoken about Bacon there, and people have asked about Comenius, and the tendency there is to say, you know, but Comenius wasn't as difficult an influence as Bacon was. And you know, if you look at the life of Comenius, it's very interesting because he's connected with all sorts of groups and some Rosicrucian groups and different individuals. But I mean, I'm to be honest, I'm really interested in your research. I'd love to hear someone who on a pedagogical level, I did have one book which was connected with education and certain funding into education and into groups in the EU, and I think it's called Comenius. I think there's a whole funding body, and I was interested that, you know, that they really see themselves under this star, under his star, you know. Yeah, I mean, for those who don't know, you know, in Steiner's Karma lectures, it's pretty clear, you know, these two worked together, and one went west, Bacon to England, the other went to Central Europe. So it's like this thing of the West and Central Europe, we have it again with these two. And I'm not a teacher, but I can only imagine that the world of education is very, very, very different than what Comenius was doing with education, with his pictures. But I can't say more, Daniel. I'm just grateful for the question.
Yes, that's the point, that if you read what Comenius wrote about education, you cannot see what you could see in, for example, Erasmo da Rotterdam. There's no, in Comenius, you cannot find something about Christ, even if he say the word Christ, and nothing about freedom, instead, and love. Instead, you find these three words in the work of Erasmo da Rotterdam. So you see two different streams about this, but I don't want to put a different theme of your relation, but I would like to talk about it, if it's possible, to have your email and
of course
something like this, because I'm working on this and I'm a Waldorf teacher and I'm a physicist, and I'm working on this. So I would like to talk about it.
How can I give my email? I can speak it, or I don't know if I can write it somewhere, but
yeah, if you maybe
I can speak it, it's fine.
Yeah.
It's Richard Ram, all one word, Richard Ram, at btconnect.com. btconnect.com.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I didn't want to.
No, that's great. I think Samuel had a question, but I'm sure there's others.
Yeah, we have line here. We have two lines of people who raised hands and people who using chat window. So according to chat window, Mark McDougall, am I right, is next. Mark, could you please unmute yourself?
That's good, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Working in theatre, have you seen any playwrights or authors that have a modern view and can look at our time or expressing it, or anything similar to what you presented between Shakespeare and Bacon? Can you see any of that in our current sort of creative world?
That's a great question, Mark. There's I'm a bit silenced, actually. I have to say, I'm a bit silenced. I'm sure there is. I can't think how. You know, I'm a bit distracted. I don't know if you know Mark Rylance, the actor. He's very famous now. And Mark Rylance, he used to strongly think that Bacon wrote Shakespeare, and then he wrote his own play about the Shakespeare authorship, which was very entertaining. But that's just on the content. You know, you're actually talking about the substance. Maybe something will suddenly occur to me. I mean, that just before, the last thing that happened to me before lockdown in England in 2020 was that I went to the National Theatre to see a play by Robert Lepage, Canadian director, called The Seven Streams of the River Otter. And then that was the last play the National Theatre did. And it was shut. And I remember thinking, what an extraordinary thing. It's a very apocalyptic play. But, you know, my basic answer is that anything that wrestles with sort of death, not, you know, understood in the widest way, and then the transforming of that is on this theme. And in a way, theatre, that's usually what it does. And theatre doesn't work without a major crisis inside it. And you know, so in a way, there's a lot of it, but it would be nice that it would go far enough. I'd love to, I think we should make time for others, because Andre said you've got to finish at 8. But you know, we get into the big question that, you know, the development of theatre. I've worked with the mystery dramas, and I'm just saying that's really interesting. If actually, you know, you look at this and see how it develops, you can actually try and put spiritual beings on the stage, or real oppositional forces. That's the same thing. That's, you start working with the double on stage, you're working with that. Like, okay, here are the forces. How do we work to transform it? And I think of itself as an art, it tends to it inclines that way. Do you have anything that comes to mind?
No, I don't. But it seems the little bit that you put about the Templars when they died, and then they became enormously beneficial. That's the essence. If we can hold that really well and have other people hold that, then whatever happens to us, the future's blessed.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's right.
Yeah, thank you. Theodore Petrenko, please.
Mr. Ramsbotham, forgive me, but I'm on the highway and I may not have heard everything you said, but I'm not that familiar with Shakespeare, but there is a book written by a German on Shakespeare that I read, and I cannot remember his name, so forgive me again, but it was so profound. I said, Shakespeare must have been an anthroposophist. Can you say something about that book? I'm sure you must know it.
I can't. It's a real, all I can say, Theodore, is I'm really honored that you drive from the car. I hope it's safe. And you speak from the car. And I don't know the book, no.
Oh my, well, I hope you find it, because I tell you, it's profound. This man makes such an incredible case that Shakespeare is definitely an anthroposophist.
Oh, I see. And you read it in German?
No, it's translated into English.
I see. Okay. Well, I'll look out for it. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Brenda Freeman. Brenda, please unmute yourself. Brenda.
Hi.
Hi.
I really didn't have a question, just a comment about the science. And
Okay.
sometimes I think that people become afraid of science in some ways. I mean, I am get the vaccine, and I've been around other people who have refused the COVID vaccine, and a number of people have just died. And so I think, how can you balance the benefit of science with some of the, the fears or the actual, maybe bullying? I think it's a difficult path to tread. I'd just like to hear a little more on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm not sure I heard all of it. All I would like to say is that I'm aware, as I do have worked in theatre a lot, that if it comes to Shakespeare and Bacon, I'm likely to come down on Shakespeare's side. But, it's not just an opposition. The future of it, as I see it, is then picked up 200 years later by Goethe, who says, okay, but science has to be developed. It's not, oh, science is, it's like people are called anti-science. Well, they're not anti-science, but maybe they're anti kind of total materialistic science. But obviously we're wanting science to keep developing, and eventually into spiritual science also. So I think it's odd when we're just expected to accept everything that a very, very materialistic science puts out. But forgive me, I'm just a bit worried about the time. Andre, you said we only have till 8 o'clock. Is that correct?
No, we don't have to. We can continue if you have some strength to continue your.
Oh, I see.
So,
I thought you meant that the sort of program stopped.
Yeah, because I'm looking, it's like 4 more questions at least, or questions or comments. So it's up to you, Richard.
No, I'm fine. No, I thought you meant that the actual Zoom thing would.
No. We have no next Zoom event, so we're good. And O'Halloran, Sean, can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah. Good evening.
Good evening.
Yeah. Good evening. Good evening, Richard. I'm calling in from Ireland.
I'm trying to see where you are on the screen here. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
I think I have a yellow hand up. One of my questions was question plus a comment is that I think we tend to overlook the science of law and legal structures. There's an actual science behind the whole law and legal structure that we are currently living under. And this whole agenda of the science, the vaccinations, you name it, that's been brought in under the umbrella of that law legal structure, which has us all contracted into. And if we go back to, I think, one of your original comments this evening on the, I just took a note on it. You brought it up very early in the interview. Was I think Steiner said that asserting the rights of the consciousness soul, which is about to develop, to allow the consciousness soul to be what it is. So how can the consciousness soul be what it is if we are bound up and trapped or contracted into a legal structure where apparently we don't have any rights? So
I'm not really able to answer you, Sean, but I would love you to talk to Terry Boardman about this. He's very, very clear about law, you know, being so strongly of the sort of previous epoch in a way, this whole basis in Rome and, you know, of how we're meant to deal with it today, because it's like something coming in from a former time, which absolutely is liable just to get us a grip. But I don't have any, I'm not versed in law, I haven't really looked into law. I'm not able to say anything very intelligent, I'm afraid. But I agree, it must be a huge problem. I mean, it is a huge problem.
Well, it's the problem that we are all going to face if mandatory vaccinations and so on and so forth will be brought in. How do we avoid it if we don't know how to stand on our rights? So that's something I try to, I've seen very little of that in Steiner's writings as well. So I know he deals with it a bit on the threefold social organism, but other than that, I think he's written very little on it, you know?
Yeah, he wrote something which I liked, which I can't quite recall now, but it certainly would have removed any sort of elitist power within the law, which would you know take quite a lot out of it. But I mean, maybe someone else can say something. But you know, obviously, if we have mandatory vaccination on a big scale, there should be lots of Zoom calls, trying, you know, with people who know far more, trying to help us know what to do about it, because I've just come back from Germany and it's scary stuff, you know. That's what the Prime Minister says he wants to have as soon as possible, and it's horrible. It's absolutely horrible, you know. And then what's the relationship between law and power? Because you know, we can't go into this one, but I mean, there are people, and maybe you know, there's a lot of wonderful people doing a lot of work with common law, saying that this will be able to do something in the face of what's coming. But I've never heard of, if we really have something like totalitarianism, of you know, some different structure of law being able to answer totalitarianism. But maybe, I don't think I can say much more at the moment, but I'm pleased that it's come up, Sean, as a question.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Okay, David Kavish is next. David, could you please unveil yourself?
Hi.
So we can see your face, maybe.
Oh, well, I'm not exactly presentable.
Okay.
Join the club.
I understand. Okay, good.
I didn't want to miss the talk in order to become presentable. So if you'll excuse me, I'll stay not visible. There's many things that this is an amazing talk, and there's I think you're very brave to take this on, because clearly there's so many things that are necessary to make it whole, and you can't deal with them all at once. And so everything that you can't, whatever path you take is necessarily incomplete. So I'm aware of that. So, but in saying that, I did want to bring up a couple of things that probably already know, but we're unable to insert into the talk just due to it getting out of control. That when you talked about this date 1413, this is also roughly the birth of Joan of Arc. And Joan is a figure that actually fits well into some of the themes of your talk, because she's sort of an inverse of what happened to the Templars, right? She actually confesses, but then she recants and goes to her death knowingly, in a horrible death. So it's kind of an interesting connection to bring to this. And then there are many things that could be said, but the one I just wanted to add is I have lived for a long time with this notion that both the British and the Americans have the subconscious soul, have the consciousness soul subconsciously, which is kind of like an oxymoron on a certain level. And what I've come to see in this time increasingly so is to take this literally. If you have impulses to do certain things that come out of the subconscious, but you are not conscious of them, then what happens is you don't see your own inner connection to them. Instead, they become things that you want to do from the outside. You project them. And so if you look at a lot of the things that are being said now and projected onto individuals outside, they would be virtuous if they were taken on by each of us inwardly. But when it's imposed from the outside, now it becomes something insidious. And also this seems to me to be a strong connection between the difference between Ahriman and Michael, that Ahriman wants to bring certain things which we would be led to in one way by Michael on our own, through our own inner work, to bring it from the outside, in which case the humanity will cease to exist as anything but a higher order animal. And I think that there's something connected with this. So we in the West, the reason I bring this up, I think we in the West have a unique opportunity then to look at these things that are coming out of the subconscious and to try to bring them up consciously rather than just accepting them on a subconscious level or even opposing them on a subconscious level. Anyway, that's what I wanted to bring briefly.
Yeah, no, thank you, David. I'm very grateful. It's a sort of unexplored area. When I first met Steiner's work, sort of back in the 80s, a lot of people sort of slightly saying, well, because the English-speaking world has this, as you say, sort of natural connection to the consciousness soul, that they're sort of, whatever the word is, they've got the golden ticket or something. And, increasingly over the years, one realizes, well, no, this is also has, you've raised one of them, these very big questions, what does it mean that it's unconscious? And I think part of the riddle of which has been part of the theme this evening of what comes out of Central Europe and the need for us to link with that has to do with this. That's where Steiner says naturally they have the ich, on a more natural level. And the consciousness soul needs transforming. I mean, if that was also part of the talk, we just end in the consciousness soul. If that's it, we've got a problem. It needs to also be transformed. I know that's speaking a bit of code, but I'm just grateful for you raising this issue of what can happen on a negative way and also positively when you say we can, work with these things that spring up. I think that's great. Yeah, sorry, I can't say more, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, Richard, we have one more question from Samuel Fisher.
Oh, great! I thought Sam had gone. You're still here.
Samuel, where are you from? Samuel.
I'm from England, and yeah, my phone just ran out of battery, so I had to run upstairs and put it on the charger. Yeah. But yeah, us three thoroughly enjoyed the presentation at Xavier's house, and yeah, it was brilliant. One thing that I just want to draw back to is just your first statement of conscience with science, in a sense. And this is one of the biggest things in which is, I feel, a European task, especially the Western, is to really understand this scientific element and really know what it is to undertake science. It is the striving for truth and the ultimate observation of truth, in a sense, or the ability to somehow deduce or infer or come to the conclusion of a truth through certain methods. And this in itself, we see with Bacon and we see with modern materialistic science, but we see it on a completely one-sided sense of only looking into a materialistic way of going forward. And as you say, this is more of an Ahrimanic inspiration of, you know, these forces of knowing that the only way that we can be redeemed is through matter. And this is a perversion of the truth in my eyes. And we could go on and look at this one-sided science and see all of its distorted forms, and even know that, you know, it's in the spiritual world, completely deluding psychics like Annie Besant and yes, you know, many others. And, you know, they end up seeing that, you know, Francis Bacon is all of it, but he is just really a symbol or a sign for kind of this delusion of what matter is all. One thing is all, and he is just a symbol for that appearing again in our times. And one of my kind of, I guess, one way that I see that anthroposophy remedies this is through, I mean, the second part of Riddles of Philosophy, where we get given a kind of detail of science right up to this point. And then what I would say is an additive on human and cosmic thought, where we are given these 12 perspectives. And these 12 perspectives from materialism to spiritism, we have on the right-hand side going through matter, sensationalism, phenomenalism, right down to dynamism and monadism with realism in the middle. And this is kind of seems to be this Aristotelian or even kind of the looking into the actually deducing things. But then on the left-hand side, we have this look into rationalism, mathematicism, idealism, psycheism, and pneumatism. And both of them are two different paths to spiritism. And one thing, I see this both in Bacon and Shakespeare. And one thing that I want to ask you a question about is, do you see the science in Shakespeare?
Thanks, Sam. Well, this is not the answer, Sam, okay, but it's the only answer I can give right now, is that my own way into anthroposophy was I'd basically lived with, you know, what's called literature very intensely through my sort of younger years. And somehow finding that for Goethe, who Goethe used to have Shakespeare read to him, and it was slightly darkened. He'd have a slightly darkened room and he'd have someone read it to him so he could just take it in through the ear. So he was, you know, he named Shakespeare as one of his three great heroes. There was Shakespeare, Linnaeus, and I'm not quite sure of the third. Anyway, so Goethe's deeply imbued with Shakespeare, yeah? And then Goethe comes to his science. And what I understood and continue to understand is that for Goethe's artistic experience was so strong that affects science. Yeah, it's not art, so some nice thing, no. This is a relation to the world that actually means science has to be done differently also. Because this is also in its own different way, a kind of cognitive relationship. It's a relationship where that experience is real and true. And that's so strong that it affects science. And that was my way in. Once I knew that, it was like, oh, well, this is it. This is the way on. But what can I say? I think Shakespeare, I don't know, I think you know the answers there, really.
Well, Susan, I think Susan gave an interesting link then. I can't actually access it properly on the phone, so, but she put forward something about the geometry in Shakespeare. One scientific element that I see in there is one that you've already mentioned, actually, is the science of idealism. And, you know, that is what Steiner was talking about, can re-enliven our creativeness now, in the sense that Shakespeare puts before us these ideals, and through the planetary moods, he really explores about how these ideals or how these characters really are shaped. And it's so brilliant how he does it, that it is a science of character in which he's giving, and he's able to depict this. And I'm still going through the works and working with them, so I'm not at the level of fully being able to discuss this, but that's why I kind of put forward the question, was because I'm just getting glimpses of this science of idealism that he put forward.
But sorry, Sam, maybe I hope you come down to Sussex and we can talk more about it. But I do just want to say that that last quotation, it's a misunderstanding if I sort of stress the idealism too much. What I wanted to stress was Steiner says, actually, you know, we can go on talking about ideals, but what about developing the actual creative strength to be able to manifest them? And that's what he says we'll find in Shakespeare. And that has been very important, you know, for myself personally. You know, we're all infected by, sorry to use the word infected, but by the sort of scientific Baconian, and to what extent have we got the ability to really transform it? And that's what I was pointing to there. But
yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that what as well you were saying there as well was that all the ideals have been created. We don't need to manifest new ones. Is that they're already there, and we just need to draw from them. And so, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and hopefully we'll speak about it in Sussex or something.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Richard, questions from me. So to clarify, line of incarnations. So because we know the previous incarnation for karmic cycle of Lord Bacon was Harun al-Rashid. So according to Steiner, so you are speaking about incorporations of Christian Rosenkreutz in those three, in order to manage natural scientific type of thinking in Western Europe.
Well, I'm really pleased you've raised it, Andrew. I don't want to say much because you know, it's late, but I wasn't talking about an incorporation of Christian Rosenkreutz in those three. If I would like to clarify that from my own perspective, it is an error of people to think that Christian Rosenkreutz is the initiate behind Bacon and Shakespeare. He's not. He's, you know, James is the individual who has this. Steiner calls him, says about the initiate behind Shakespeare and Bacon. He calls him a strange, a troublesome patron, patron or patrona in German, which you know has its own meaning, but it's also a joke because James was literally the patron of Shakespeare and the patron of Bacon. And then he has this connection. So, I mean, I don't know if it's, you know, possible to clarify it more now, but I see more Christian Rosenkreutz as this, you know, this sort of one of the greatest initiates there is, I'm sure, you know, who certainly incarnated in Central Europe. The lives described were in Central Europe. And the question is whether in the West, a connection can be made. So Steiner says this true side of James I connects with the true culture of Central Europe, whether it can be in a connection or whether it isn't. And then it just sort of separates as the West. But I'm not suggesting that Christian Rosenkreutz was coming through those three. That's why I said more it's like a holding hands than, you see what I mean? The way that James works into Shakespeare and Bacon is another matter, but he was close to them in life, yeah? And he knew them both in life, so it's...
Yeah. So last question, let's do maybe last question from Gerald. Gerard, I'm sorry, Hermans. Yeah, please unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, yeah, thank you.
Hello, good evening. I think the topic is also very interesting from the point of view of karmic studies, so to speak. So our host, I forgot your name, I'm sorry. You mentioned the karma cycles from Rudolf Steiner, where there's a lot of attention. A central theme in the beginning of those karma lectures is about Francis Bacon, sorry. So that's really remarkable that Rudolf Steiner gives so much attention to this particular person. It's also known that in the beginning of his work, Rudolf Steiner also knew this controversy about Shakespeare. It was well known to Rudolf Steiner himself. He mentions it in letters that he wrote to in a very early stage. So it's rather important that at the end of his life, he returns to this theme and gives it a full impact analysis from karmic relationships that he. So that's, I think, I'm very much looking forward to part 2 and part 3 of your book, Richard, because I think it was a wonderful book. I have enjoyed it so much. I think it is one of the most creative books I've ever read in the Anthroposophical Library. It's really a genial book, I believe. In my opinion, we have to look into the karmic relationships that are lying behind these themes, because that's the reason there is so much confusion and so much intrigue about this topic, because people are unconsciously aware of all the karmic threads that lie beneath it. People somehow feel that already now in our times, and that's the reason they try to make this into, to give it a different solution, a solution that's more in accordance with their personal point of view.
Yeah, that's right.
And so one of those karmic relations you also mentioned in your book, and you made a connection with the Templars, the Templar Knights in the Middle Ages. So, and maybe that's, I don't know whether that's true. I can't judge that. I'm just not sure. But of course, the Knights of the Temple, they were also connected with the temple in Jerusalem. Already in the title of their order. Yeah. So maybe the relationship with those temple knights goes a little bit deeper and has to be found, can be found maybe in the real building of the temple in Jerusalem, thousands for Christ, because that was time where we know from other sources that also Shakespeare was incarnated, that we have the story of Homer, we have the stories of King Saul, King David, King what have you. So we have a lot of interesting topics over there lying in history and coming, in my personal view, coming together in the 17th century, the beginning, and maybe also the 16th century. So that's just an amazing karmic topic of research, which is, I believe, it's a personal view, I'm just completely unsure, just a personal view, is lying directly under the surface to go there and research. And for example, we can also think about the legend of the temple that Rudolf Steiner mentions, this story about conflict between King Solomon and this builder of the temple from some other country in the Middle East, I forgot. And yeah. So this story, when is this story presented in public in European culture? At what time? I think it's before the 17th century. I'm not sure, maybe 15th or 16th century. I mean, we can imagine Christian Rosenkreutz to make this story present, to make it public in European culture, to help people understand what's coming in the 17th century, because all those people are preparing their incarnations. And then he gives this legend to make it more comprehensible for us. And then we again have this theme of the temple legend as a conflict between Christian Rosenkreutz on the one side and Mr. James, King James, on the other side, perhaps. So I see a lot of interesting work for part 2 and part 3, so thank you.
I think it's a great last question, because it was not a question, it's like just taking us all into the future and into, but you're right. I mean, it's such an extraordinary time, such an extraordinary time. The 30 Years' War, there's somewhere where Rudolf Steiner says really strange comment. Almost like everybody was incarnated then. I mean, he doesn't say, he just says so many people were incarnated at this time. So yeah, it's very rich. Thank you, Gerard.
Well, thank you very much. And we're already working for 27 minutes more. Yeah, dear Richard, thank you so much for your rich and very live presentation. And I hope we will collaborate in the future. So, and dear friends, I would like to personally, as program committee chair of Chicago Rudolsteiner Batch, to invite you for 10 events during 12 Holy Nights. Yeah, they are all in announcements, which are sent to all of you. And yeah, and please unmute yourself and greet Richard. And I think we're gonna finish. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Richard.
Thank you
Thank
very
you, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Andre.
Those are about you,
Thank
yeah.
you, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much.
Okay, cheers.
Where is your book available?
Oh, I'd suggest, I mean, I know some people never use Amazon, but if you do, you'll find it. But otherwise, it's published by Temple Lodge in England. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So you can get a copy still.
Steiner Books has it.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, good night, friends.
Bye, Matthew.